The family that vacations together stays together. At least that was the plan. Except now the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want your connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
When your destination is discovery, there are no wrong turns. That's why, at its very core, the new 2025 Lincoln Aviator SUV provides momentum beyond mere transportation. In this thoughtfully crafted and confidence-inspiring SUV, your destination is not about where you can go, but who you can be. Explore more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Aviator trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
Even if we go with the most skeptical data, you still have to conclude that a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi from Judea and Galilee walked the first century dusty streets of Roman occupied Palestine and made some pretty audacious claims, potentially claims to be God himself, and then was crucified, and that his followers claimed that he rose from the dead. I mean, the fact that we have 4 biographical accounts of an individual from the backwaters of the Roman Empire in Galilee is very, very unusual. The only other person that is comparative to the amount of biographical information that we have about Jesus from this kind of window of antiquity is actually the Roman emperor. I think we can say that Jesus stands in just as much credibility for his actual events of his life as the most powerful, most influential, most important person during that time.
All right, welcome back to Blurry Creatures. As you know, we've been rolling on this Blurry bus for several years now, and we've gone all over the place. Whether that's modern UFO sightings, abductions, people to underground military bases, and people seeing weird creatures, to ancient times, hanging out, watching giants walk across the promised land. Whatever, we've gone everywhere in this crazy Blurryverse, and we like the scholars to come on our show and kind of take us back and give us context to the ancient times, help us make sense of some of these modern day sightings and the blurry stuff that happens on a regular basis. And whether your grandma has a story or you've seen something weird, we know you're tuning into Blurry Creatures for a wide variety of reasons. So appreciate you having here. We're going to get Wesley Huff on the show today. He's one of those scholars, and he's getting his doctorate right now and goes back and he makes videos and tries to give context to some of the sort of the half-truths that spread around the internet these days, and tries to give more full truth and a more, a full view of okay, this is kind of true, but not completely. He's got a great channel, and we're going to talk about, we just released the Book of Enoch, so we get into some of these things, and people debate it on our channels. But we can talk to Wesley about the scripture itself. Can we trust it? And what's some historical context behind that? So this is a great combo.
It's really cool. I love what Wes does on his channel, and I think, these are important conversations. If we're going to talk about everything from Bigfoot to UFOs to ancient history, and we're going to talk about it from a biblical standpoint, then we should really talk about why we can trust the Bible as the source of truth, and that's what Wes does. And so this will be a fun one. He's a scholar. It's got the evidence. It's got the history, and we walk through some of the things that probably for Christians have become sort of second nature. But it answers a bunch of questions like, is the Bible accurate to what was written? Is the book of John the same as it was when it was written? Is the book of Isaiah the same as it was when it was written? Are these things trustworthy? And Wes contends they are, and this is a great conversation for people that are skeptics, and also for folks that want more than just to believe because they believe, because there's evidence out there, and we shouldn't be afraid to look for it when it comes to believing the stories and the text of the Bible.
Yeah. So if you want to support what we're doing here, blurrycreatures.com/members. Like always, got a bunch of stuff coming down the pipe, and your membership produces this show, keeps it going. Let's get Wes on this one. Go back.
Walk like an Egyptian, Nate.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Welcome back to Blurry Creatures. We have a fun episode for you guys today. Wesley Huff on. Wesley is, I've probably seen some of his videos that have been going around lately, addressing some of the wild ancient alien stuff and other theological conversations that happen a lot in these spaces. Wesley, thanks for coming on our podcast. It's the first time you've been on our show. You have a master's in theology and you're currently doing your PhD right now in New Testament. And it's good to have you on the show. Our podcast gets strangely biblical. We talk about a lot of the weird stuff here. And one of the ways we do that to kick off the conversation is ask everybody from Dr. Michael Heiser to whoever.
Tim Mackey from the Bible Project is my favorite one to reference because he had no thoughts on Bigfoot, but we ask everyone at the top of the show because we started out as a Bigfoot podcast, and then we started saying, "What else is weird out there that we can talk about as Christians that just doesn't get addressed from the pulpit or in our circles that probably needs some addressing? Otherwise, people don't really have a context for it." So we ask everybody, and we kind of joke it's sort of being baptized in the Blurry verses. Wes, what are your thoughts on Bigfoot, if you have any?
Yeah, you know what? It's funny because I have a good friend. He comes to our house every Wednesday for a Bible study that we do. And he is thoroughly convinced. He's got like Bigfoot t-shirts, Bigfoot hats. He's got like the Bigfoot stickers on his water bottle. We have a couple guys in our church actually who are like Bigfoot paraphernalia guys. But and he's been talking about this with me for a while. And when I mentioned that I was going to come on with you guys, he was like, "Oh, you got to talk about Bigfoot with them." And so it's funny. He did send me. I said, "You know what? Send me what you're listening to that convinced you." And so he sent me a bunch of podcast interviews of Bigfoot encounters. And I can't say I'm convinced, but you know what? I'm enough of a bit of a skeptic that I'm totally open to the idea. I mean, I analyze historical evidence and I'm constantly dealing with things like eyewitness testimony in ancient documents. And I don't think it's completely unreliable in terms of some of these stories. Man, there's a lot of weird stuff out there. Yeah. And a lot of stuff that is, we like to put things up in a nice square box and tie them up with a bow, but reality is a lot stranger than that. So if Bigfoot does exist, I mean, I'm totally okay with it. But I don't think I have any, if you want to call them personal convictions, although the chair of the board of the organization I work for, Apologetics Canada, has a cottage that we occasionally go up to on Sasquatch Mountain in British Columbia.
Oh, wow, dude.
So I've been to Sasquatch Mountain, if that means anything.
Yeah.
It sounds like a fake place. It sounds like a fake place. It's like, I was hanging out. I've got a cabin up at Sasquatch Mountain. You're like, that isn't a real place. That's not actually.
Yeah, that's right.
You're in Sasquatch country up there in Canada. I mean, the Pacific Northwest, and there's so many sightings that come out of that area. And I think that where Blurry Creatures kind of started was, I grew up in the church and I grew up all these different denominational backgrounds. Every kid in my Christian school was a different denomination. And so I got a little taste of all these aspects of Christianity. And then, in my 30s, started really just hearing these stories from these paranormal stories. And I just was so interested in if this stuff is real and these things are out there and this kind of, this whole elusive side of I don't know, creation or maybe the defilement of creation, because we get into that a lot on our show, is, there was this point in time when creation was corrupted, like everything, if you really go back to the days of Noah. And could this be some sort of remnant of that event, those days, and it's kind of lingered on to this day. And so that's kind of how Blurry Creatures started. And then Luke and I started with Bigfoot and asking like doctors, academics, like, what are your thoughts on Bigfoot? And then it turned into this. Well, then they started talking about the ancient giants on our show a lot. And then we got into this. There's whole categories of giants that were tribes of giants and modern day sightings and digging up skeletons. And so Blurry just became sort of shoved into the biblical space. And we have conversations on our podcast that the church doesn't want to have, but are biblical. And because it's a podcast,
you just say whatever you want, right?
Well, that's 100% right. Yeah. You don't have I don't have any elder oversight. They're saying, hey guys, by the way.
Yeah,
that was a bit wild. Yeah.
What's funny is I grew up on Kent Hovind Young Earth Creationist VHSs. We had like a 7-part series, and one of them was about dinosaurs. And I definitely remember, the Ogopogo and the Loch Ness Monster, and he would talk all about that stuff. Now, since then, in my more academic endeavors, I've kind of peeled back a lot of the maybe not as very sound methodologies that someone like Ken Hovind, who ended up going to prison for tax evasion, and there were lots of issues there, had. But I'm not a stranger to them. Arguably, I grew up on a lot of those kind of more unusual stories about.
And Wes, one of the things we talk about on our show, and what I think it was Michael Heiser said, is that like for all the thousands of encounters, and this is where we are kind of our crux that people have or reportedly have with a creature like Bigfoot, on an annual basis, and there's thousands across North America. If even one of those is true, and say 99% are a lie and one's true, if one's true, then we have to expand our paradigm to sort of encompass the idea that there's a big hairy creature that lives in the woods. And how do we contextualize that? And that's kind of that's some of the things we like to talk about. So, but as you talked about growing up, one of the things I wanted to start with before we got into it, and personally, the reason I'm real excited to have you on, Wes, is I love your work. You have some amazing videos called "Can I Trust the Bible?" It's one of the conversations I wanted to have, is that if we're 200 and almost 50 episodes into our show, and it rests very heavily. Our foundation is the biblical text. It's like, how do we make sense of the weird in the world if we are Christians through the Bible, right? But before we get to that, as you're talking about growing up, and we're an 80s show too, so VHS is right in our wheelhouse. You've got kind of a crazy story, and I wanted to just to bring everyone on, listen to us and introduce you up to speed. But you grew up, you were born in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And then I'll let you go from there, because you have a pretty amazing story how God intervened in your life in a very tangible way that kind of sets you on the course that we're sitting here today as the Central Canada Director of Apologetics Canada, and finishing your PhD in New Testament. But you got there really intentionally because of what happened in your childhood.
Yeah. So, the listener can't see my complexion, but you would not be able to tell that I was born in Pakistan by my skin tone. I can't wear my skin after Labor Day; it's too white. Mm-hmm. So you're
in good company here. We got a ginger. Come on now. Right. Nate's allergic to the sun.
There you go. All of our ancestors were cave dwellers somewhere in Europe, and so it does no benefits to us living in sunny areas of the globe at this current point in time. But yeah, so I was born in Pakistan. My parents were missionaries in Islamabad, and then during the Gulf War, we were forced to leave and came back to Canada for a little bit. Ended up going back overseas, where I spent a portion of my childhood when I was really young in the Middle East. So my parents worked in the capital city of Jordan, in Amman, and that played a big part into even some of the work that I've done since then in my apologetic career with Muslims, having lived in majority Muslim countries and interacting with the Islamic worldview. And that, like I said, played a big part. But my story, which I think you're alluding to, Luke, is that when I came back from overseas, my family was living in rural Ontario, and I was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that left me paralyzed from the waist down. And so the short story is that I had the flu and was home from school on a Wednesday, and I'd gone down for a nap on the bathroom floor, for reasons that we don't necessarily have to go into. And then I woke up early in the afternoon and I couldn't feel my legs. And so I called my mom, who called like an ambulance, and I was rushed from one hospital to the other. And when I was eventually settled into a hospital where they were able to test me, I was diagnosed with a condition called acute transverse myelitis, which is a word you can forget as soon as you hear it. But what it means is, as they described it to me, was that my body's immune system, instead of attacking the flu, attacked the nerve endings at the base of my spinal cord, caused inflammation, and left the communication between my legs and my brain cut off. And so I was told, after being tested and living in the hospital for a week, that the chances of me walking were very, very low, to 0, and that I was most likely going to be a paraplegic for the rest of my life. And so that entered in questions. I was 11 years old at the time, entered in questions that could arguably be described as apologetic. Why do bad things happen to supposedly good people and those types of things? But the short story of what I do consider to be a miraculous healing was 1 month from the day that I woke up and couldn't feel my legs. I woke up on a Saturday morning, got out of bed, walked over to my wheelchair and sat down. And that was it. And so I had a regular scheduled checkup where I went back, and it was the doctors who first used the word miracle and said, we really don't have a medical explanation for this. In fact, I have my mom's journal entries. She photocopied them for me some years ago, and I have them in an envelope. And she has recorded that the doctor asked her while they were talking, what did you guys do? And she said, we prayed. And he went and he printed off a list of the other kids in the intensive care unit, and maybe jokingly, maybe not, said, hey, do you mind praying for these?
Wow.
And that did spark what I truly believe to be a powerful supernatural experience in my life. And yet it didn't negate me having intellectual doubts later in my teen years, trying to measure up, okay, well, something happened. How do I make sense of that in light of questions about meaning and purpose, but also intellectually about, things like, can I trust the Bible? Or what do I do with origins? What do I do with science? What do I do with all of these different areas that seem to, at least in terms of the cultural conversations, be pushing against what I have been raised to believe? Mm-hmm. And so I knew that believing in Christianity, because my parents raised me to, it probably wasn't the worst reason, but it might not be the best reason. And so that's when I really started to dig into some of these questions. And fortunately, living in a household where I had parents who were missionaries, my mom was raised a missionary too. She grew up in India. And so we had documents like the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran or the Book of Mormon on the shelf in our living room. And although it was never said overtly, I felt very strongly that what was communicated in my upbringing was, if Christianity is true, it can handle you looking at these things. They're not verboten, they're not forbidden. Christianity can stand up to other objections and worldviews. And so I did, as much as a teenager can with, some of these physical copies and the internet, digging into some of these questions and looking at, well, what are the best rebuttals? Who's writing the objections to what I believe? And then trying really to figure out, okay, well, does that make sense? Is that a better explanation than what the Christian worldview is offering? And at the end, coming to the conclusion that, no, I think Christianity does make sense. I think it does answer the ultimate questions that I'm looking for, both emotionally and intellectually. And that process kind of connected the dots between my head and my heart, and having that experience as a child, but then also saying, okay, well, now, because of the publicly available evidence, I truly believe it's true, the capital T. And that journey led me down to where I am today, doing a doctorate at a secular university, a PhD in New Testament studies. And I'm a manuscript guy, so I look at some of our earliest copies of particularly the New Testament, but digging into some Old Testament manuscripts as well. And that has only strengthened my faith. It's only given me more confidence that what we have now is what those original authors wrote, and that it is an accurate representation of particularly the events and sayings and teachings of Jesus Christ.
If we're going to foundationally as believers believe in the Bible, these 66 books, that they are the inspired word of God, and that they are inerrant, and that's where that's the foundation of our faith. How do we, because this is your work, how can we pragmatically, walk us through pragmatically understanding that and the things you found? Because you are an ancient document guy, whether it be Old Testament, New Testament, right? Like, we've talked a bunch on the show about the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, and all of the copies of of the books there that we could, that provide a history that we didn't have up until the early 1900s, right? We just had sort of whatever survived the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple in 70 AD, and those things are great plans, great understanding. And we talked to Dr. Michael Heiser, we talked about on the top of the show, about the Old Testament
Walter
and
Martin.
the Hebrew and everything that we can look at it in the first 5 books and going through Genesis. I want to focus on what you've done and kind of how you have taken this idea of can we trust it and pulled this thread, kind of working, maybe reverse engineering the biblical text to prove its veracity.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has been hugely beneficial and encouraging to me is when I really started to study the biblical languages and got kind of narrowed my area of interest into the biblical manuscripts themselves, being able to have the opportunity to look at some of these manuscripts in person and to go and see something like I actually have a facsimile of it on my shelf behind me, but go and see something like a document called P66, which is a late 2nd, early 3rd century, the copy of the Gospel of John. And to see, okay, this is an 1800-year-old copy of John, and it preserves for us almost the entire gospel, but particularly the first few chapters. And to open that up and to be able to read, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and think, man, when I open an English translation, that's exactly what I'm reading. Mm-hmm. I don't, I'm sight translating this, and what am I coming up with? What sounds like the NIV, right? So just the tenacity of the Christian scribes over the last 2 millennia to preserve those words, and then the diligent work of translators throughout the centuries to render those in the language that we now understand today. Like you mentioned, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the fact that before the 1950s, the only copy of Isaiah that we had was from the Middle Ages.
Right.
It's from the Masoretic text. And so when we uncover the Dead Sea Scrolls and we find a complete copy of the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is predating Jesus by 300 years, and it is word for word exact to the copies we have in the Middle Ages. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal. Not just, there are a few differences here and there. No, word for word exact. Now, I have to be careful with that because that's not true for all the Dead Sea Scrolls. But even just using that as an illustration of saying that there's a level of confidence that we have with how these documents have been preserved, and even finding out that the mistakes and the additions and deletions also contribute to our ability to have confidence, because one of the factors of early Christianity was that the Christians were so eager to get the word of God out into the hands of believers. And so they didn't ask for your qualifications. There was a scribal kind of process within the Jewish community where you had to have qualifications. And that had a great benefit in terms of something like the copying of what eventually became the Masoretic text and that middle-aged copy of Isaiah. There was a procedure of very careful checks and balances there that allowed that to happen. The Christians had somewhat of the opposite problem because they were so eager to get it out that, you don't have a copy of John. Well, here, make sure you copy this. And the end result of that was that the copies are not always as carefully copied and in their manuscripts. And so mistakes happen and people write notes in the margins. And then other scribes later don't know if that note in the margin is supposed to be part of the text. And so they include it, and all of these things happen. But this happens at such a crazy level that within a few centuries, even decades of the originals being written, there are copies of the New Testament books, even the Psalms and some of the Old Testament prophets. They're in Asia, they're in North Africa, they're in Europe, they're even as far as the British Isles. And so now we have this giant, massive pile 2,000 years later of all these manuscripts. And it's actually because of the mistakes that we can find out exactly when, where, and sometimes why deletions, additions, or scribal insertions happen. And that gives us confidence, because if we only have one copy, you have to be sure that that person got it right. Mm-hmm. And if you have 2 copies, even if there are mistakes, you can compare them. And 3 copies and 4 copies and 5 copies, we're talking thousands of copies. And so with thousands of copies, you can really be able to trace that text back And so this is what's referred to as textual criticism. I was actually last week, I was in Oxford in England attending a conference of text critics. And we are talking about some of these things about, the methodologies that we use to trace the text back. And everyone in that room, believing or not, agrees that we have what the original authors wrote to pretty much 99.9% of a level of accuracy. And so it's because of this kind of massive amount of information that we're able to do something like that.
I think it's so important because there is a bunch of folks out there in camps out there to say that what we're reading is manipulated text and that it's done purposefully and willfully and and some people even say to deceive sort of the meanings of the author. And what you're saying is that no, they actually, and I think that this is so interesting. Like I hadn't heard this, but the fact there's so many copies is so important because then you get to look at sort of the breadth of all of the copies and see, all sort of the changes, and you can track it all the way. You can reverse engineer. You track it all the way backwards to the actual text. And and
that isn't true for a lot of ancient documents. The Beowulf, right? I think Beowulf is the first English written book, but we only have one copy of Beowulf from the ancient world. And if I'm remembering the story correctly, it was only preserved because someone threw it out of the window of the museum it happened to be in when the museum was burning down. And so, in terms of if we want to talk about the textual history of the document of Beowulf, we can't analyze that in the same way because when you only have one, you only have one.
It's one source document. Yeah,
exactly. And this isn't something we just do with the Bible. There are text critics that work on Homer. There are text critics that work on, Julius Caesar, Cicero, Aristophanes, even people who work on Shakespeare, because, there are no original quote unquote copies of Shakespeare. We have copies. And so in one sense, there are scholars who actually debate, maybe this word should actually be that word. So it's not something that's unusual with the Bible, but the Bible, we just have so much more to go off of that the conversations can sometimes they can sound really complicated or overcomplicated, but that's just because we have so much to go off of that we can have these conversations to begin with.
What are some sources that really give you a lot of context to the scripture, so that kind of support it, give you an idea of what they're alluding to? Because something that Luke and I kind of come up a lot on our show is that we try to make sense of some of the weird stuff that happens, and also in the scriptures. There's a lot of these wild moments in the scripture that don't give you a lot of backstory, so you don't really know what's going on. And what are some other documents or things that you feel like support the text and the canon that we do have today?
Yeah, so I think there are in terms of details about the stories. Is that what you mean? About some of the things we read.
Or any corroboration?
Corroboration, because I think a lot of people reject the biblical story because they don't have context, and I think that's why we have so many different denominations today, because everyone's reading the Bible and coming to these conclusions, and they don't always have a lot of context of, okay, this is what's happening in this story, but, when you go back, you realize that the ancient writers seem to have a catalog of works that they knew that were influencing the way they were writing and who they were writing to.
Yeah, the Bible doesn't exist in a vacuum. These people exist in real places in real times, and we're interacting with other individuals of their times. Paul, when he's on Mars Hill, he quotes pagan philosophers to the Greeks, right? He's aware of their literature. He's quoting individuals like Menander and Aristophanes when he's interacting with these cultures, because that's what their context would have been. Or, Jude quoting the Book of Enoch, or, these are sources that would have been publicly available. And even just something like, it's an apocryphal book in the sense of the deuterocanonical books that we don't as Protestants have in our Old Testament, but First and Second Maccabees are historical documents that chronicle a time period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. That kind of valley between Malachi and Matthew, things happened, right? And that gives context. When you have the story of Judas Maccabeus, going into the temple and rededicating that. And then you see in John chapter 9, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem for the feast of the dedication, that's Hanukkah. That's what happened in the stories of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees. And so I think maybe as Protestants, we can have this kind of pushback because, the Catholics have those books in their Bible and we don't think they're scripture, so we're going to ignore them. And unfortunately, what that does is that then has us floating in history where we're losing context for understanding. Not that you need to understand what the Feast of Dedication is in John chapter 9, but man, does that fill out the context of, okay, I understand what's happening here. I understand. And then that gives context to Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, which is what Judas Maccabeus does. And the kind of understanding that the first century Jew seeing that happen would have drawn their attention. Oh, Judas did this and he rededicated the temple to God. What's going on here? Because Jesus is drawing on Old Testament prophecy, right? That the Messiah would ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. But then there's also this kind of cultural context of that. And then he is alluding to and fulfilling those things. And so that can give us filling out the frame, as you will, of sort of these things. In terms of like historical events, I was, as I mentioned, in England last week. And if you go to the British Museum in London, you can enter a room that includes a wall relief of an individual called King Sennacherib of Assyria. And we actually find the story that's chronicled on that wall in 2 Kings 18:30 or 13:15, where it says that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, he attacks Judah and he tries to take over Jerusalem, but he doesn't end up, he sieges Jerusalem. But it says that what he does do, even though he doesn't end up destroying Jerusalem, is he sacks a city called Lachish. And if you go to this room in the British Museum, which originally comes from Iraq, but you see the wall relief that they've pulled off of the wall from the old temple, the old palace, and you can walk through it. And it has Sennacherib, king of Assyria's throne room from 2,700 years ago. And the room originally included a series of floor-to-ceiling carvings. So they're about 40 feet tall, and they depict this conquest over Lachish, which is the second most important city in the kingdom of Judah after Jerusalem. And so in 701 BC, Sennacherib led this vast army against Judea. And as both the biblical and historical record tell us, King Hezekiah had rebelled against the Assyrians, and then he's confronted with the world's greatest war machine at the time. And we didn't discover this wall relief until 1845 in modern day Iraq. And so before that, all we had was the biblical story. So if you were to go to a monk in the 9th century and say, hey, who's Sennacherib? He would say, oh, he's king of Assyria. Hey, look, let's open to the 2 Kings. But all of a sudden we have this corroborative archaeological data that has a depiction from the other side of what we see going on in 2 Kings. And then there's a prism, I think it's 8-sided. I think it's octagonal. And it has all of these listings of the king of Assyria's conquests. And once again, it mentions King Hezekiah, and it particularly says that, portraying Sennacherib in the best light, not, hey, I failed to destroy Jerusalem, but he says, as for Hezekiah, I shut him up in his royal city like a bird in a cage. And so these types of kind of corroborative ancient documents from the ancient Near Eastern world also shed light on some of these stories. And obviously we don't have corroborative evidence for everything in the Old Testament. Yeah. We've never found Abraham's tent, nor do I think we ever will. But these kind of things lend credibility to the fact that, okay, every time we stick a shovel in the ground, we're finding something that at minimum confirms people and places and times. And as Christians, we can have confidence that, whether we're talking about 2 Maccabees, or whether we're talking about the Lachish relief, or whether we're talking about something like the Book of Enoch, or whether we're talking about all of these documents have their place in time and history, and they give context to the things that we read about in Scripture.
When we were kids playing Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, all we wanted to do was get to the end. And how do you get the body of Mike Tyson?
Well, you want the body of Mike Tyson in the 80s, not probably not now, although he's pretty svelte, Nate, you know. And one of the things that we're doing in our 40s here is trying to get our bodies right.
That's right.
So what I'm doing, I know you're doing, is drinking AG1. And if you haven't heard of AG1, it's a foundational nutrition supplement. That means each serving delivers everything my body needs, like a daily dose of vitamins, minerals, pre and probiotics, and more. It's a powerfully healthy habit that's also powerfully simple.
Yeah.
And I decided to try this, Nate, because I didn't have the energy I used to have. And so I drink this before my morning coffee. I got my whole family drinking AG1.
That's right.
It's a habit that makes me feel better and really gets me going in the morning.
Yeah. And a research study, 97% of people felt more energy in the first 30 days. And you need energy to get all the way to the end, to Mike Tyson.
That's
and
right.
if I had to recommend one product to support whole body health, it's AG1. That's why I'm excited to welcome them as a new partner here at Blurry Creatures. It's easy and satisfying to start your journey with AG1. Try AG1, get 1 year free supply of D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase at drinkag1.com/blurry, BLURRY. That's ag1.com/blurry.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least that was the plan. Except now the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want your connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
When your destination is discovery, there are no wrong turns. That's why, at its very core, the new 2025 Lincoln Aviator SUV provides momentum beyond mere transportation. In this thoughtfully crafted and confidence-inspiring SUV, your destination is not about where you can go, but who you can be. Explore more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Aviator trademarks afford its affiliates.
When you find a deal on your favorite thing in the McDonald's app and order it, does that technically count as online shopping? Save money with the app. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's, prices may vary.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so interesting because I feel like as time continues to roll on, it's like there's a new discovery all the time that backs up the biblical narrative. It feels like it's happening all the time. I know there's folks right now that are specifically in the Holy Land, digging up things, trying to find the location and finding evidence for Sodom and Gomorrah and the burning of that space, and then the evidence for Jesus. And you talk about things like Josephus and his accounts that also back up everything that we see, or a lot of things, not everything, but everything, a lot of the things in the New Testament that we see as a Roman historian. What about, have you done much work on sort of the evidentiary, maybe the pile of evidence for Christ?
If we conclude that we can't know that Jesus existed, then we also have to conclude that we don't know anybody in the ancient world existed.
Correct. Amen.
Because we have, even if we go with the most skeptical data, you still have to conclude that a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi from, Judea and Galilee walked the first century dusty streets of, Roman occupied Palestine and made some pretty audacious claims, potentially claims to be God himself, and then was crucified, and that his followers claimed that he rose from the dead. I mean, the fact that we have 4 biographical accounts of an individual from the backwaters of the Roman Empire in Galilee is very, very unusual. And the only other person that is comparative to the amount of biographical information that we have about Jesus from this kind of window of antiquity is actually the Roman emperor Tiberius at the time. Because during this time period, there are only 2 people who have more than about 1, maybe 2 biographical sources of their life. The first one is Jesus, right, with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those 4 biographical accounts. And then Tiberius has Velus, Patroclus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo. And so at face value, I think we can say that Jesus stands in just as much credibility for his actual events of his life as the most powerful, most influential, most important person during that time, that being the emperor. And so if we can say that, if we can put him parallel, and I would actually say that the evidence is actually quite a bit better, because those four individuals that I mentioned, Velus, Patroclus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassio Dio, they're not just writing about the emperor. They're writing about a number of other things, and they mention the emperor, but they're actually writing about a whole host of other individuals. In fact, both Suetonius and Tacitus also mentioned Jesus, but these other individuals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're only writing about Jesus, right? It's the gospel, the evangelion, the good news, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what is the good news? Well, it's that Jesus came. And so that's the purpose. And even those sources that we have for the gospels, our earliest copies are being written earlier than the copies that we're finding for the life of Tiberius. Apart from the one individual who I mentioned, Velus Patroclus, his is actually pretty early, but he's a Roman paid propagandist. So in terms of historical credibility, he's often seen as a little bit suspect because he's like on the payroll and he has incentive to make the emperor look really good. But all the other guys, they're writing in decades after even the latest books that are written for Jesus. In fact, if we're talking about almost everybody, including Roman emperors, but particularly religious figures like the Buddha or Muhammad, our latest evidence, written documentary evidence for Jesus, is still earlier than our earliest evidence for almost every other religious or political figure within the ancient world. So those who are casting doubt on the credibility of the historical Jesus are really doing so at the expense of history. Right. It's almost always an indication of, hey, you're probably not aware of the historical data. And if you are, you probably don't understand it. Because if you want to say Jesus never existed and the historical information is suspect, then let's grab bag everyone else, pre 1700s and say, well, we can't know anything about them either, because the standards that are often held, you want Jesus's thumbprint and his social security card. You're not going to get that. Yeah. But on the basis of how we actually do history, we have phenomenal evidence for the historical Jesus.
So in addition to your work on Can I Trust the Bible, some of the stuff you've been doing, which I really loved, was looking at some of the other documents and claim documents that have really kind of blipped on the internet lately. And one that really comes to mind is Billy Carson, who was on Sean Ryan and also on Joe Rogan, making a bunch of claims about the Emerald Tablets. Then there's also the Gospel of Thomas, Infancy. There's all these documents that exist out there that people run with, right? Really without spending any of the academic work or digging into the veracity of these, right? And to me, it makes sense because we live in this sort of, we digest information in 30 seconds or less, right? It's the idea of let's watch the reel, let's watch the YouTube video that's 90 seconds, and this has got to be good information. But I thought it was really powerful, some of the work you did. And I want to start with Billy Carson because he makes a bunch of really crazy and wild claims. And we haven't talked about this on the show, the Emerald Tablets, which maybe we've referenced before, but can you talk a little bit about some of the things that were said and then your take on that? And then I'd love to get to the Gospel of Thomas and some of the MC Gospels, these other documents that have sort of come to the surface really in the last few years that people are pointing at and saying, this means this, and this is something that you need to understand and believe to be true, and yet without really any, I would say, provenance, right? If we're talking like in the art world, like you have this tracing of where this stuff came from, and you can verify that it is what it is, right? If you're looking at like a Van Gogh or a Picasso or something like the Mona Lisa, we can track the provenance. We know exactly that it came from the artist, and here's where it's been, right? And so you can say this is authentic. This is actually the correct, or this is the original painting. So that it's this idea of implied trust in the accuracy. So, and I know one of the ones, actually, the reason I reached out to you was sent to me by a buddy. Shout out to Todd Smith out there, but it was on you critiquing Billy Carson in his expose on the Emerald Tablets.
Yeah. Billy Carson is interesting because he takes a lot of the right words and uses them in a lot of the wrong ways, which if you're an average person just scrolling through Instagram Reels or TikTok, it can sound very persuasive because he's throwing out the Sumerian tablets and the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. And he's talking about the Book of the Dead, and he's talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you have no framework for what these things are, the confidence that comes across in a guy like Billy Carson can be very persuasive. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, and I struggle to give someone like Billy Carson the benefit of the doubt. I want to, but I have colleagues who read Sumerian cuneiform. Like there are people who actually read this stuff. And the things that Billy Carson says are either almost slightly true but misinformed or completely false. And it's very tricky because you're kind of weeding through. He'll get some things right, but not quite in his conclusions about them. And then other things are just, I have a hard time believing that he doesn't just make them up. I mean, he's written a whole book on the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, but the Emerald Tablets of Thoth don't exist. They're not a actual document. If you went to Egypt and you asked an Egyptologist, where do I go to look at the Emerald Tablets of Thoth? He's going to say nowhere, because they don't exist. Yeah. They were invented, if you want to put it that way, in 1925 by a guy named Maurice Doreal, who was a kind of lay archaeologist who went to Egypt. He went to the Great Pyramids of Giza and said that he discovered this artifact, and then he produced a supposed translation, but he never actually produced the tablets, and the content within the tablets contradicts large swaths of other things that we do know about ancient Egypt. So not only is the translation that, sure, you can go on Amazon, you can buy a translation of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, but what you're getting is just the production that Maurice Doreal in the late 1920s came up with. But this isn't actually a legitimate ancient Egyptian document. There are plenty of those. In fact, we have tons of stuff from ancient Egypt, but this is on the level of, just modern day fabrication. It doesn't exist.
It does sound a lot, honestly. What I think of first-handed when you hear this is the Book of Mormon. It's a guy finds these golden tablets, and then there's this translation, and no one's produced the tablets yet, right? And then it's just like, well, trust me, this is what it says. And you go, it sounds a lot like, like that. Like,
I think there's a parallel there in that you do have examples of people saying they discovered things, and then when actual academics are like, okay, well, that sounds really interesting, let's look at it, they go, oh, oops, we don't have it anymore.
Right.
The emerald or the golden plates got taken up to heaven by an angel. Okay, well, that is convenient.
Very convenient. Yeah, you're like, well,
nobody can fact check you.
You're like, trust me on this one, right? You're like,
yeah. But someone like Billy Carson, he doesn't just make passing references to the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. It's essential to his thesis, and it's not persuasive to anybody within the field of archaeology, Egyptology, historiography, classics, any of these, because we know these things. We know where these documents are, and I want to be charitable when I interact with people who are making claims about ancient history. But when you base your entire thesis on something that is a known, this is not a hidden thing, it's a known fabrication, nobody thinks this exists, then it's hard then to give you the benefit of the doubt in all the other things you're saying. And unfortunately for Carson, he then goes on to say a lot of other wild things that are just not based in reality either.
Well, I was going to say, can you, for our folks that listen to the show who aren't familiar with the Emerald Tablets, can you surmise real quickly what's in that that fabrication or that document, that because it does just for a tiny bit of foundational knowledge here.
Yeah, so the Emerald Tablets are once again claimed to have been translated from hieroglyphics, and it's a pendium written by claiming to be written by Thoth, who was the ancient Egyptian god of wisdom, and talks about how he enlightened the humanity and 35,000 years ago helped do things like establish the building of the pyramids and all these things. And so Carson makes a lot of this in terms of, the provenance of how old it is. 35,000 years ago. Well, that's really old. And, it mentions the pyramids. It mentions some other, bringing of knowledge to people, which kind of has parallels in some of the other Atlantean theories. And so he draws on that as well, saying that, Thoth was an Atlantean, and then draws connections between some of the other Sumerian literature, and then claims that he, Billy Carson himself, can read a little bit of Sumerian, which, as someone who has tried to learn Sumerian, so I actually got interested in Sumerian. This is a bit of a side. When I was doing some research on John Marco Allegro and the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Are you guys aware of that stuff?
No. I haven't heard of that.
You'd find that really interesting. It was Joe Rogan really likes to talk about it, where there was this, he was a legitimate Dead Sea Scrolls expert. He was part of the original team. And he kind of went a little off base, and in the later years of his life, actually claimed that Christianity was an invention of a psychedelic mushroom cult.
Okay,
and so he traces some of these words etymologically in the Greek of the New Testament and the Hebrew of the Old Testament into Sumerian. And so I was fact checking some of these things, and I was consulting with some people who I know who are Assyriologists and can read Sumerian. And they were saying, no, this doesn't make any sense. But when I was trying to make heads or tails of Sumerian, I was like, man, I can read some ancient languages. Yeah. Sumerian's a tough one. And so I would like to give, once again, Billy Carson the benefit of the doubt and say he knows some Sumerian. But as someone who tries to read ancient languages and does so for my academic career, I have a really hard time believing that. And then to make those connections between the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, which don't exist. There's too many intersections of silliness. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I think you can amass a lot of followers these days, and it's harder to. I think when people actually become fans of your content, you have to have some, credibility. And I think there's we get thousands of videos sent to us on a daily basis, and we have to kind of sift through it all. And we're trying to bring as much credibility to these topics as we can, whether it's alien abduction, Bigfoot, or whatever. It's like, what's the actual data? And we bring a lot of doctors on our show who have thoughts on Bigfoot. And believe it or not, Wesley, some people have had encounters that they're here to talk about some theological subject. And they're like, well, my grandpa has this story and I believe him. And it's like, and so I think one of the things we do on Blurry Creatures is try to go through the data and be as scientific as possible, and not just sensationalized materials, but you can get millions of followers doing that.
Well, and to me, Nate, that sort of methodology, Wes, like of having just enough truth that it becomes palpable, really is like kind of the blueprint for deception, right? You just have just enough truth that it feels like it's
the garden story. It's the garden story over and over again.
It 100% that.
And that's the original lie, right?
Yeah.
That's the original lie that Satan told even the garden, right? If you eat the fruit, you will be like God. That's true. But it's not what he said, it's what he didn't say. How are you going to be like God and knowing what is good and what is evil? Well, it's not enlightenment in the sense of becoming God. It's understanding what it means to rebel and try to call the shots on your own terms.
Right.
And so it's just that tiny kernel of truth, but that ultimately, leads to the entire fall of creation.
We see that on a mass scale today. I think that news is it's like two truths, and you got to figure out which one's the lie. They look and they smell exactly the same. That problem rages on, and it's only getting worse. Pick a topic,
And I can understand that. I can understand that we live in this age of almost information fatigue.
Yeah.
Because we know so much about so many topics, but we don't know any one topic very deeply. Because we just assume that I can pick up my phone and Wikipedia it, and I can get a synopsis, right? Or ChatGPT can give me just the bare bones of what I need to know.
Oh, here's your book report. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. But then we forget. And it also is compounded by the fact that we should be doing our own research, but also there are experts who have devoted their lives to it. But experts also say stupid things. And so I totally have sympathy for the average person who is scrolling through TikTok, because exactly what you said, Nate, it's so hard to try to sift through all this stuff. And when you're encountering people like Billy Carson or others who are saying things very confidently, and they're, throwing out these terms, you don't necessarily know, okay, well, I'm hearing about, ancient Greco-Roman history, and I'm hearing about Sumeria, and I'm hearing about Egypt, and I'm hearing, where do I go to try to find the information for that? Now, some of that can actually be debunked. You can look at the Emerald Tablets of Thoth on Wikipedia, and it will actually tell you that it doesn't exist. Right. So in that sense, that's great. But some of these things require a further level of digging. And it's disorienting when we hear all these things and they're kind of intermeshed with some good information, some bad information, some just made up information completely. And I can understand why then people are like, hey, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna take everything, or I'm gonna take nothing. Those kind of
it becomes a zero sum game, right? You're like,
yeah.
And that's so. On that note, though, Wes, you've also done some work on some other documents that have really come to light in the last few years, and one is the Gospel of Thomas, and there's a few others. I would love for you just to kind of run through a little bit of the things you found, because this is the same story as Billy Carson, right? Inevitably, these things pop up. The source seems like it's trustworthy because people are talking about some of these documents as matters of fact. They get discovered, and if the discovery feels, authentic, but you've done some really good work, I know, especially in the Gospel of Thomas, and I know you're gonna, at the end, we'll ask you to point people to the work you're doing. But I spent time watching it here. I've been mostly on paternity leave the last month with a newborn, and we were emailing, and he sent me some of your videos, which I thought were fascinating, because I didn't know a whole lot about the Gospel of Thomas specifically, and heard it thrown out there. And you start to wonder, like, why is there a gospel in quotes? I use that in quotes where you guys are listening, not looking at us right now, but of Thomas that isn't in the Bible, right? Thomas was a disciple, right? So you can start to go down these rabbit holes, and people that don't spend enough time looking go, yeah, this is a disciple. His book must be real. His book must be trustworthy if he's someone who walked with Jesus. So tell us a little bit about that one, because I think that one's fascinating.
Yeah. So we do have these other gospels, right? The Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, that have these names that are associated with individuals who we read about in the biblical gospels being within these inner circles of Jesus. Right. And so what do we do with the fact that, sure, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but then you have the Gospel of Thomas. Well, Thomas was a disciple. So why do we reject Thomas and not have that in our Bibles, but say that these other ones are credible, especially when Mark and Luke aren't disciples?
Right.
Thomas is a disciple. So the short description of that is that when this was discovered, so just to back up, and I share this in the Can I Trust the Bible episode 1, the Right Books episode, where my colleague and I, Andy, we went out to Egypt. We went to Nag Hammadi, where the Nag Hammadi library was found, which included documents like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, and told that story, how and when it was discovered by these Bedouin farmers in 1945. And eventually landing in the hands of academics and being analyzed. And lo and behold, it's this document that claims to be written by Thomas, the disciple of Jesus. Now, when we actually analyze the content of Thomas, we find that both there are some external factors and some internal factors that are very problematic for it. Although there were actually fragments of the Gospel of Thomas that predate the 1945 discovery. We had actually 3 Greek fragments, which were found at a place called Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, which we also go to in episode 2 of the Can I Trust the Bible series. But Oxyrhynchus, P-Oxy 1, P-Oxy 654, and P-Oxy 655, which are just the category numbers that are irrelevant to the average person, are these fragments of when we found the complete Gospel of Thomas in 1945, confirmed, okay, that's what these actually are. We weren't really sure what they were before. They were sometimes just labeled as another story of Jesus or something like that. But then we find this Gospel of Thomas and we're like, oh, that's what this is. So the one discovered in 1945 is not in Greek, it's in Coptic, which is sort of a downstream version of ancient Egyptian. And it is not what we think of when we typically think of a gospel. So when we think of a gospel, we're probably thinking of something like you have Jesus's birth, you have his life, and then it includes his death and his resurrection. Mm-hmm. The Gospel of Thomas is not that. It's a sayings gospel. So it's just a list of 114 sayings between Jesus's disciples and Jesus. And it has, although it's very, very early, it's from the 2nd century, it has some content in it which associates it with a group that developed within the 2nd century called the Gnostics. And the Gnostics were a religious sect. It's kind of problematic even to group them in one single group because there were no one group called the Gnostics. There are a bunch of different kind of ideologies that existed within the ancient Near East, and particularly later on when it incorporates Jesus into Greco-Roman antiquity. And they even disagree with themselves. You know, the Gnostics contradict, in some Gnostic gospels contradict other Gnostic gospels. So it's not this cohesive unit. But nonetheless, aside from all that, this umbrella term of philosophical and religious sects, we can say that there are some kind of unifying factors, particularly that the Gnostics, unlike biblical Christianity, didn't believe that salvation is something outside of yourself done on your behalf by the finished work of Christ on the cross, which is what we believe as Christians. So along the lines of, 2 Corinthians 5:21, Hebrews 10:10, that for our sake, the Father made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Christ we might become the righteousness of God, and that by the will of the Father, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Christ Jesus once for all. The Gnostics didn't believe that. They actually believed that some salvation was something inside of you. So it's not just that Jesus is God, but hey, Nate and Luke, you're actually God, and you unlock that reality by knowledge. And the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis. So that's why we give them this kind of category. And so you read the Gospel of Thomas, or you read the Gospel of Philip, and you find these sayings that are very strange, and they're strange on purpose. And they range from, like, the Gospel of Thomas is not the strangest by any stretch. There are some where you read it and you're like, I don't know what's going on here. Yeah. It's almost jibber jabber. Yeah. But that's done on purpose because the idea is, if you're enlightened, you're going to understand this. Okay. And so you're in the club and you've unlocked your divinity. And part of that was realizing, kind of like modern Eastern mysticism.
Yeah, it sounds like New Age a little bit.
And I think this is why modern sort of New Age groups have latched on to some of these documents, is because they do have these themes that you have the divinity locked inside of you and you can release it. And like Buddhism, that the physical world actually is an illusion, and it's by this secret knowledge that you realize the physical world is an illusion, and your spirit, which is trapped in this meat prison of a body, it's actually then released into the universe. There are these kinds of ideas, which you can see why sort of this kind of esoteric modern New Age belief has latched onto some of these. Right. Unfortunately, they latch onto that stuff. They don't latch on to other things, like a highlight in the Can I Trust the Bible series, where the last line of the Gospel of Thomas has Peter saying, hey, Jesus, you need to kick Mary out because women are not worthy of life. And Jesus' response is not, hey, that's a weird thing to say, Peter. It's, hey, Peter, don't worry, because I'm going to make her into a man like you men. And then the last line of the Gospel of Thomas is, every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. And so it's like, grab onto the stuff you like, but I don't know if you want to grab onto that one. But you have this kind of stuff. And that goes part and parcel to, there's kind of an anti-feminism vibe in a lot of the Gnostic literature, because they believe that the physical world was evil, and the creator of the physical world was this evil demiurge who was encompassing of the feminine in their philosophy. So there's actually a strong strain of antagonism towards women in a lot of the Gnostic literature.
And it also sounds a lot like, it kind of makes you think about like this whole Christ consciousness movement that's also kind of happening here, that you've got, where it's not really, we don't really need to believe in Jesus as our savior, but we can all sort of tap into this Christ consciousness. And and we've talked about this on the show. It feels like in some ways atheism is dying, right? So all these folks out here are spiritual. You see it online, where I'm spiritual, and in that they're grabbing onto things like the New Age and to mysticism and Eastern stuff, because subversely empowering, right? Because it just tells you you're, in the same way the garden, you can be like God, you can be like the gods, you are a God. It's a lower G God, and you just have to unlock that. And then it's this whole deception on Christ as just an enlightened teacher, just like the other ones that they'll want to name. And you just kind of, and it turns into universalism and New Age and all these different things, which ultimately just find their roots in the occult.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fascinating because it is also deceptive, right? Because you have this pseudographical document that names itself after a disciple, which we know that all those things were done to garner credibility, right?
Yeah, and that's a level of kind of shoehorning credibility into the document, right? It's appropriating a level of credibility that it doesn't have, but it's kind of kidnapping the credibility that the Christian community already has associated with these individuals, right? Because nobody's going to, I mean, there actually is a Gospel of Luke, so I can't use your name as an example.
It's a good one.
Nobody's going to read,
it.
right, the Gospel of Bob, right? Because they're like, well, who's Bob? I don't know who that is.
He wasn't there.
But, yeah, nobody trusts Bob. So they get a name that somebody does know, right? And they often choose disciples who are not the main disciples. So Thomas or Philip, and these characters often in some of these Gnostic Gospels work as fodder, where the big name ones, Peter, James, and John, when Jesus is interacting with them, Peter, James, and John are getting all the wrong answers. But then Jesus goes to Philip, and Philip knows, he understands. And then Jesus pulls him in secretly and reveals the secret knowledge to him. So it's almost, it's kidnapping credibility in one sense, but it's also trying to read the skepticism onto the individuals associated within the biblical documents too. And in terms of kind of the wild nature of the content of some of these, the people who we were talking about before who might doubt that Jesus ever existed sometimes read the biblical Gospels and go, this miracle stuff, that obviously plays against his historical reliability. That's obviously embellished. Until you go and you read the Gnostic Gospels, where all sorts of crazy things are happening. So before the program, we mentioned, we're talking a little bit about some of the infancy Gospels that exist, where they try to fill in the gaps where the biblical Gospels don't tell you much about Jesus' childhood. We have this one story in Acts. Jesus is 12 years old. He goes to the temples, and Mary and Joseph lose the Son of God on their way back to Nazareth.
The worst parenting move of all time. You're just memorialized for forever, right?
Yeah. If you think you're a bad parent, just remember that Mary and Joseph lost the incarnate Word of God.
Lost the Son of God at one point. Yeah.
Yeah. But we don't, other than that, have really anything about Jesus's childhood. And so there's later literature that's written in centuries after Jesus's death, but that try to tell some of these stories. And if we're talking about embellishment, I mean, Jesus he's doing all sorts, he's really naughty is what he is. He's pushes a kid off a roof and the kid dies, and then he resurrects him back to life. There's one story in the Arab infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas, that actually makes its way into the Quran, where Jesus is making clay birds beside a river, and then he breathes on the birds and they become, so back up. The Jewish officials see him making clay birds, and it's the Sabbath. And so they get really mad at him, and they go to find Mary and Joseph, basically to get him in trouble. And then Jesus breathes on the birds. They turn into real birds, and the evidence flies away. And that story is in the Quran. It's one of the stories in the mentioning of Jesus in the Quran, where the author of the Quran clearly did not know the difference between apocryphal and canonical, and so incorporates it because they didn't know any better. But you read some of these other stories, or stories about Peter staying at a house, and the bed is full of bed bugs, and so he rebukes the bed bugs in the name of Jesus, and they file out one by one outside of the room. They're like, you read these stories, and then you go back to the biblical Gospels, and you realize, they're actually kind of matter of fact. Yeah. Like, they're really trying to give you a clear picture and not go over the top. Whereas there's later writings that have no qualms about going over the top. And that kind of level, if we're talking about the hyper skeptic, that actually lends credibility to these early documents as historically reliable. But in terms of the people who want to incorporate those, there's a complication in regards to just historical reliability and verification. These documents are clearly embellished. They're full of all sorts of other things. They're portraying Jesus as a pagan mystic, which and showing no evidence of first century Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, anything like that. They're making Jesus palatable for a pagan Roman audience. And so by that nature, they undermine their credibility.
So good, man.
Honestly, it feels, Wes, like there are deities or spirits over certain ideologies. And I don't know, they masquerade with this, like, I see it as like a 4D chess move. I don't see this as just human beings getting creative. It seems like they're getting some of this, they're using the occult practices to get some of this information. They're mixing it in and they're putting it back out there, and people are running with it. And you have these huge groups of people that embrace it. And depending on how spicy it is, it can really take off, you know? It can really become a thing. And maybe you can sell 5 copies of your book, or you can sell 5 million, you know? And I think depending on how seductive the spirit is behind some of these movements determines its popularity. But it seems as though there's a lot of these rabbit holes that
it reminds me like Dan Brown, Nate, like where you have this whole idea of this secret bloodline that the Holy Grail is actually like this child, right? You have this, and that idea runs wild. It's a novel, and people start to believe this narrative.
Yeah,
I guess why I really appreciate your work in the things you're doing, because I feel like in a time where people are looking for evidence and can find it in all sorts of semblances, if you will, online, that the more that we can provide this evidence for the text that we base our faith upon,
right,
the more we can be assured that we are not being deceived in a sea of deception. It's always been that way, right? So I'm not saying this is new. It's always been this sea of deception meant to draw the image bearers of the Most High God away from Him, right? This is Genesis beginning. This is the beginning of the beginning, right? But we live in unique times where I feel like we talked before, TikTok, YouTube, these people can digest things in such short pieces. They don't follow up or look for the evidence in it. That I just feel like the work, and that's why I really appreciate your work, man. And it's been really a pleasure to have you on, because we shouldn't be afraid to look for the truths, even in our own faith, right? We shouldn't be afraid of that. In fact, what you contend, and the evidence shows, the mountain of evidence shows, is that not only can we trust the Bible, but it stands up. Archaeology, linguistics, documents, it all stands up. In fact, in a way that you really can't replicate, as we just talked about earlier in the show, with things like Roman emperors, who was the leader of the entire world, right? I love these conversations. I'm a history nerd, and Nate knows this. Like, whenever we get into history, whether it be biblical history or archaeological history, ancient history, these are my favorite conversations, because I feel like we don't look, it's the old adage, right? If we don't learn history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I do think it's so important to also know why we believe what we believe.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And that's what I'm dedicating my life to. And I'm under no qualms that this isn't also a spiritual battle, right? What does Paul say to the church in Ephesus? For we're not wrestling against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of the heavenly places. And so Satan and the demons have been around at confusing people and misleading people for a lot longer than, the Billy Carsons and the Richard 100%. Dawkins and the, whoever you want to insert there. And so there's a level of, yes, I'm a historian. I'm a linguist, I'm a papyrologist, I'm a, insert all these kind of academic categories. And man, I'm so appreciative, and it's a true honor and privilege to be able to study those things and to do things like handle near 2,000-year-old manuscripts and see the verification. But one of the things I say in the presentation that I give on the reliability of the Bible is, man, if my presentation had you walking out of this room merely believing that the Bible was a collection of historically reliable documents that probably came from eyewitness testimony, then I think I would have failed, because the Bible is no less than that. But oh boy, is the Bible more than that, because the Bible contains truths that go far beyond the material world, right? You matter more than you are matter. And we don't just believe in a physical world. We believe in a spiritual world, right? Which is stuff you guys highlight on your podcast.
Yeah.
And also when Jesus asked his disciples in Mark chapter 8, who do you say that I am? That's arguably the thesis of the entire Bible. The whole 66 books is pointing to Jesus, because Jesus is, I mean, you can find him in Genesis, right? In the promise of redemption. And then he's predicted by the prophets. And then he shows up on the scene, first century, and he predicts his own death and resurrection and makes audacious claims to be God himself. And then he pulls off what he claims, right?
That's right.
And I would argue that people who rise from the dead have more credibility and authority than people who don't rise from the dead. And so that means we need to take that seriously. There's this great quote by C.S. Lewis where he says, Christianity, if true, is of infinite importance, and if not true, is of no importance. But the only thing it can't be is moderately important. It's either everything or it's nothing.
Yeah, it is a zero-sum game. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think we live in a day and age, like you said, Luke, where we're so privileged to be able to actually dig into this evidence and see these documents. And information fatigue aside, I think it's really important that we're conveying just the mountains of evidence as clearly and as concisely as possible, because people need to know this stuff, because people need to be saved and delivered from sin and hell. And the consequences of knowing the proper historical information don't just stop here on this side of eternity, but they go into a time without end.
That's a mic drop there. I love that. Well, man, thank you for this, Wes. We'd probably love to have you back at some point to continue conversations about, I mean, I think we could talk for hours about this, but because your work is public and because you're putting it out there for folks to see, like, we want to just give you a chance to tell people where they can find what you're doing, what you're working on, your videos. You know, folks listening, you can get out there and look at Wes's work, because this has just been a quick 90 minutes, if you will, of, scratching the surface, an overview of what you've spent 10,000 hours doing. And so if folks want to engage, where can they find what you're doing, Wes?
Yeah, well, right off the top, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. As many opportunities as I can to talk about this stuff, I try to take, because heaven knows my wife is sick of it. So somebody's got to listen to me, right?
I get the same thing at home here with Blurry stuff. Just like,
Yeah, so if people are interested in what I'm doing, they can head over to wesleyhuff.com, WESLEYHUFF.com. That would be the easiest place. That's where you could find all my social media handles, the infographics, videos, articles, blogs that I produce. I also work, as was mentioned, as the Central Canada Director for Apologetics Canada. So you can go to apologeticscanada.com and you can find out where I'm speaking next and what conferences we're running. If you happen to be in Canada and happen to be in Ontario, we're going to be running a conference in Burlington in November. So that's kind of the next upcoming big one that we're doing. But we run 3 conferences a year across this country. So apologeticscanada.com is the place to go. Otherwise, you'll find all of the other stuff that I do at wesleyhuff.com.
Awesome. Thanks, brother.
Thanks, man.
This is great. It's good to get to know you, man. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah,
and,
likewise.
A privilege, because I really love just all the history and the documents and just the defense of the faith, right? Like, I just think it's such an important topic, and I think easily people are pulled in directions by persuasive deceptions. Thanks, man. This has been fun, dude, and Yeah, I love it. We actually may be getting to Canada at some point in the next couple of years. We've talked a little bit about doing one of our little conferences up there. So, but if you ever come down to Tennessee, you end up this way in Nashville, West, you better hit us up because we're both on opposite ends of Nashville, Tennessee. Nate's north and I'm south, but we'd love to see you, man. So we just appreciate the time. Yeah.
Well, that'd be great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And
All right,
yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Wes. Appreciate it, bro.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Cheers.